this episode, I talked to Sanji, who lived for 10 years as a Sanyasin at the Rajneesh, later known as Osho, community in India. We talked about whether gurus are relevant nowadays, about subtle energy massage and her work with Michael Barnett, working with Bob Moore, PsychoSynthesis, Trillium Awakening, spiral dynamics, and what lies beyond waking up to our essential nature as the ground of being. So, Sanji, welcome to this new venture, the podcast, guest number 2. So we met quite recently, actually. I think we connected with each other via email probably 5 months ago, something like that. So I'm excited to get to know more about your story. Some of the guests I'm having on this podcast I've known for a long time, and I know lots about them. But our acquaintance is quite a new one. But I wanted to get you on here to hear your story because the theme of this podcast series is hearing the stories of people, that their personal journey with this kind of multidisciplinary, holistic, integrating type of practice, where they're pulling in these sort of pure strands from the world's traditions, and weaving their own unique blend. My hope is that this can be a service to other people who want to take up this type of approach to life, or people that might already been doing it for a while, but want to listen in to, like a fly on the wall, to other people's stories, because it really, I find it really helps that. So perhaps you could just say how you first got into this, what I just call a multidisciplinary approach to spiritual practice, shall we say. I'm sure you've been doing things for a long time, but there must have come a point where suddenly you realized there was more to the picture than what you had been doing.
Maybe. I think I'm just a multidisciplinary person.
Okay. Yeah.
When it comes down to it. So I was basically broadly Christian in my, not particularly upbringing. My family weren't particularly religious or anything, but I kind of got into Christianity. And then I went to university and studied sociology and psychology. And from that, I became a researcher, and in the disciplines of sociology and psychology. And for the last 34 years, I've worked at the Tavistock Institute, which is a not-for-profit organisation that does consultancy research, trainings, professional trainings, group relations, and it's a multidisciplinary organisation, so I felt totally at home there. But it's underpinning a system psychodynamic thinking. So I'm not a psychodynamic person myself, but I've been there long enough. And in my original psychology course, we touched on Freud and psychotherapy and such likes. So that's one side of my life. That's my sort of professional life. I'm essentially a researcher, but in a very broad discipline. And interestingly, one of my main interests currently is complexity. And complexity means plaited together. And the image I always use when I'm talking about complexity is a nice Celtic plait. So when you were talking about those sort of interweaving, I'm so at home in that interweaving of different ideas and themes. It's what I bring to every part of my life, really. So that's what I mean. It's so part of me that I can't say when it came in. But anyway, at university, I was part of the Christian chaplaincy for a while, but I kind of fell out with Christianity because there were quite a lot of evangelicals around telling me I wasn't the right kind of Christian. So I said, fine, okay. So I kind of parted company with the Christian God on good terms, saying, if you're around, I'll meet you again. And then I found out a little bit about Eastern religion and started to pick that up as an interest and meditation.
Whereabouts were you during this time, like geographically?
Okay, I grew up on the Channel Islands in Guernsey.
Oh, okay.
So I'm a Gern. So
I've been to
even
Jersey
that,
a couple of times.
right. So even that, you see, it's like we're a little bit French, we're a little bit English,
Mm.
bit betwixt and between.
Yeah, that is quite relevant, really, isn't it? That's an interesting background.
I think so, and it's a small place there, so there's everything you need in a small space, so everything overlaps. And then I went to Bristol University, which was okay, not the best years of my life, and after Bristol, I didn't know what on earth I was going to do, and I enrolled with a charitable organisation called Simon Community, which works with homeless people, and got sent up to a community up in Glasgow. So I was working with Glaswegian homeless people for a couple of years, and through them I encountered AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, which I was very impressed by, and I was actually very impressed by some of the recovering alcoholics I met there. I was very touched by them and their story and how they were as people. They were very wise, sensitive people. Some people say that, you know, if you're sensitive growing up in Glasgow, the only thing to be is an alcoholic, because it's a way of dampening down the pain. So through that, I got very interested in the power of groups, self-help groups. And around the same time, someone called David Brandon, who worked for Christian Action, was doing some research on homelessness, and he came up to Glasgow. And he, at that time, was quite involved with growth movement in London and something called Enlightenment Intensives. He later wrote a book. He was a professor of social work for some years, and he wrote a book called Zen and the Art of Social Work. But anyway, he sat me down and started to go through the Enlightenment Intensive question, which is, tell me who you are. Thank you. Tell me who you are. And I was so shaken up by this experience, I had to go to bed for the rest of the day. But out of that, I kind of, you know, I want to explore this, and I want to explore the power of groups more. And I'm not an alcoholic, so that's not an option. But I, through him, had heard about the growth movement, which was just getting going in London, really, with lots and lots of different encounter groups and Gestalt groups and body therapy groups, all sorts of things. So after I'd finished my stint in Glasgow, I came down to London and started exploring the growth movement. And I started with an encounter group with someone called Michael Barnett, who then became really central in my development at a later stage. And then I moved on to join a 6-month intensive with someone who had recently come back from India, where she'd been a follower of Osho Rajneesh. And in those days, we called them Sanyasins. Mm-hmm. So she led this group in her orange robes. And this intensive it introduced us to a different therapy every month, really. We had lots of different people coming in and running workshops and weekends. And at the end of that, I did a lot of body therapies through that time, which were very powerful for me, and a lot of screaming and shouting in encounter groups, which were also very powerful for me.
Can I just pick up on a couple of things that you said? So this growth organization movement, I really like that, because one of the ways you could define the types of people that have this multidisciplinary approach to transformational practices is they have a growth mindset. Kind of out there in the culture is quite prevalent, this idea that once you finish school, you're done growing. And that never really sat right with me. I mean, in so many ways, I felt my education really started when I left school, because I was able to be in charge of what I was learning. Well, not in charge, but I could direct my own learning for the first time ever. And I love meeting people that are interested in growing across this broad spectrum of their identity. And I love the way this growth movement had all of those modalities and techniques plugged into it, really experimental. And the other thing that I noticed was Osho, a very, very controversial character in many ways, but extremely brilliant at the same time, and very, very much one of those pioneers of integrating different traditions. Yeah, that's
so I got involved. I became a Sanyasin after the group finished and went out to India for 6 months. And he would give a lecture every month on a different spiritual tradition, and always talking about the esoteric core of the tradition. So, just being around him and listening to his lectures, you got an input on all the core spiritual esoteric traditions that there are, most of them anyway. And then he gathered around him in the ashram all these therapists from the human potential growth movement. So there were all these workshops and different kinds of meditations taking place in the ashram that you could take part in. So yeah, it was brilliant. Really good.
Have you seen quite a popular documentary at the moment? It's called Wild Wild Country on Netflix.
Yeah, everyone.
Have you seen that? Yeah.
Well, okay.
I just think when people when you bring up Osho,
they think about
what
okay. Well,
what most people have heard of Osho is the Rolls Royces, the all the sex and all that kind of stuff. I have had a fairly shallow encounter with Osho's work, relatively, but I know that there's actually a lot of, if you can get beyond all of that kind of public facade that so many people are engaging with, beyond that, there's something really profound in this Osho thing. I mean, maybe you could just say a little bit more. What were the great things? I mean, other than these wide-ranging lectures he gave, what were some of the other things, say, to do with the community and that kind of thing that you took away as valuable lessons from that experience?
Well, I was involved for about 10 years, lived in a couple of centres, America and London. It was a very loving, very authentic community, because we were all both meditating and doing a work on ourselves simultaneously. It was, and a lot of the work, he was pretty extreme. I don't know if you ever came across the dynamic meditation, but that was what got me into, because I was doing this body work already, and then I saw his dynamic meditation, and I thought, boy, I can do that every day for free instead of paying large amounts of money for an expensive weekend.
Yeah.
I'm a meanie when it comes to it. So, I started doing dynamic meditation, which involves, fast breathing, jumping up and down, screaming your head off, going crazy. It's all pretty extreme stuff. But it opens people, and in a way that nothing I've done since does, to quite such a deep extent.
Could you describe, for people that don't know what dynamic meditation is, could you just describe it a little bit?
So it's an hour-long meditation, and for the first 10 minutes you breathe fast and furiously through your nose. Don't think I can do it. Standing up, and very often you do it with a blindfold on, so that you're in your own space. Then after the breathing finishes, you go crazy for 10 minutes, and just whatever you want to do, scream, shout, jump around, roll around the floor, anything you feel. And again, in your own space, so you're not interacting with other people, you try and steer clear of other people and their stuff. Then after that, again, a voice or a bell or something and you jump up and down with your arms in the air shouting "Who," and I think that's a Sufi thing, but it's like it forces the energy up from the belly, sort of "Who, who, who." You do that for 10 minutes, and then a voice says "Stop," and you just stand totally still for another 10 minutes, wherever you are. You don't move anything. You've got snot coming down your nose, which you probably have by then. You just leave it there. And then some very, very beautiful, because there were some lovely musicians. I mean, some very famous musicians who are still out there, Deuter, people like that. I think the music at the end was Deuter music. He was part of the ashram. Beautiful music comes in, and you just gently dance for the last 15 minutes after that. Then you go and have your breakfast.
An
empty stomach.
that seems reminiscent a little bit of the five rhythms dancing. Have you come across that now?
No, I've done five rhythms dancing. Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean,
there were other meditations that he did. There was a Nataraj meditation, which was dancing for 40 minutes, which I would say more like. I mean, I think.
I was thinking about the different sort of phases that you go through with the
phases. Yeah, but there's nothing quite like breathing through your nose for 10 minutes, jumping up and down.
No. I mean, they are different, but I'm always sort of interested in how these things, develop over time, and possibly some of these dynamic meditations. I don't know. I haven't actually looked. Might have fed into this five rhythms work.
It may well have. I don't know. No. So, I mean, the other thing about sannyas in those days, and this was dropped when he left America, and just say I never went to America, I only went to India before he went to America. I mean, I went very early on, so there weren't many Westerners there at all. It was mainly Indians and a few Westerners, and before all the groups came in and before all the crazy sex thing happened. So he was just an Indian guru with some pretty powerful meditations at that point. But at that time, if we wanted to become a follower of his, a Sanyasin, as it was called, he called it neo-sannyas, we wore orange. We wore a mala, some beads around our neck with a picture of Osho, and we changed our name. So it was a pretty radical shift. And one of the things I've been talking to people in various spiritual organizations recently, because one of my interests is on spiritual organizations. And that whole process of identity shift when you get into a new spiritual practice is something that can be quite disorientating for people, particularly if you're trying to maintain your normal life alongside it. And I suppose one of the things about sannyas is that shift into a new identity was very marked, and it was almost held and contained. So you couldn't kind of pretend nothing had happened to the rest of the world. Here you are suddenly appearing in orange and saying, please, will you call me by a different name? You didn't have to, but, so I was, during that time, I was working in the civil service in the Department of Health, and I was an orange civil servant. I would go to work in my orange, and my colleagues took it very well. So, unlike my then husband, who I married while I was during that period, and becoming a local authority housing officer in an orange suit was a little weirder, I have to say. But the other thing about the orange was that you would see someone in the distance and recognize them instantly. So there was a very strong visual component to being in a community.
Yeah. I'm just plugging some headphones in. There we go.
And then, I traveled all around America for a while, and I went to groups in Europe and all sorts, and there were centers all over the place, and you were sort of could go to any center and feel part of it. Was very a strong family feeling in the whole movement.
Could you say something about the the emotion, the interpersonal emotional work you were doing, the sort of we might characterize as psychotherapeutic work you were doing in that time? You know, what did that look like? I mean, I think you know, the types of meditation Osho were doing, people would be familiar with. But what was the, you know, how were you, I think you said, working on your stuff? You know, how did that come into it? Because I
Well,
mean, it's so important to.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of the people from the human potential movement became involved in Osho, with Osho, and became part of his community. And so there was encounter groups, and there were Gestalt groups, and there were bodywork groups, and there were, you know, any therapeutic modality that was kind of around was part of the community. For myself, I mean, I did a lot of encounter, quite a lot of Gestalt, mainly in groups, not so much one-to-one work. And it blasted me into a very sort of authentic sharing with other people, because when you're doing an intense group like that, you can't hide.
What does an encounter group look like?
Right.
What might go on?
So you're sitting around in a circle with a group leader, or perhaps two group leaders, and you're invited to share whatever's going on, but you're also invited to share any feelings that are coming up about other members of the group, and then encouraged to address that authentically. Now, one of the problems with encounter groups, from my point of view, was it pushed people into very extreme emotions. So there was a lot of tears and shouting and screaming. In Osho, there was a time when it was no limits, so there was real fighting going on, and sometimes real sex going on in the groups. That stopped after a while. Too many broken bones. But you know, for a while, it was some very extreme confrontations going on. I think in terms of working on subtler levels of emotion, I mean, there was a lot of caring and love and hugs, and you know, the whole group hugs and all that kind of thing as well. But it wasn't a safe enough space usually to do the kind of deep trauma work that, you know, now we understand with somatic traumatic work, Peter Levine and stuff. You have to have a totally safe space so that you can enter into the traumatic experiences and come back to the safe space and titrate between the two. And that was missing, basically. It was like, if you can just get in there, thump a pillow, shout at someone, that will get rid of the trauma. And we know now, actually, we were probably busy re-traumatizing ourselves in some cases rather than actually. But I mean, for me, I rediscovered my anger, which I'd totally clamped down. I had quite a bad temper as a child, and when I was about 12, I tried to throw my sister downstairs, and sort of at the top of the stairs, and my sister, I suddenly, oh my God, you know, it's like, this is not good. So from that time, I actually didn't experience my anger or my temper. So it was like I was able to get in touch with anger again and loosen up. And that released a lot of joy as well, because if you're clamping down on one emotion, you clamp down on all the emotions, really.
Yeah. It's not
So
it's not precision clamping, is
no,
it? But that's a really common story. With sorry.
yeah. Well, no, I'm just saying there was a lot of joy in the group, because you know, when you start releasing all that emotion, out of that comes a lot of ecstasy and joy as well.
I love it. I think it's so bold, what was going on there, and it's pioneering, you know, and it's anyone who's doing pioneering work, you know, is great things happen and awful things happen, and it's
Absolutely.
you know, but that's the sort of progressive impulse, you know. It's the opposite. The sort of more conserving impulse never likes to do anything dangerous. They're both important. I mean, you need a conserving and a progressive you know, impulse, really. But
But
well,
there
you know,
was a lot. Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that I liked about the community is that it was really encouraging individuals to flower as individuals, and so although there was a lot of group stuff going on, you know, a lot of people I knew in sannyas were isolates. You know, they liked to keep themselves to themselves, and that was fine too. You know, it's like there was space for everything.
I think that getting in touch with owning and integrating your rage, you know, is a very common story for people that get into spiritual stuff. You know, when you first get into spiritual work, I mean, this is a generalization, but it's quite common conversation I've had with people, and it's certainly been the case with me, that you kind of think it's all this kind of very quiet, you know, you think of you know, the sort of archetypal image of these really peaceful, saintly characters that you assume never get mad or angry. But then you sort of, after a while of doing that, you realize you've kind of cut off a fountain of life force, you know, and then that spurs people onto this journey of becoming familiar with their own anger, you know, and that's quite a rocky ride. But so worth doing, and you know, it takes a bit of time to do, but very, very, very important thing to do, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose because I mean, briefly, I got involved with Krishnamurti community before getting into Osho, but Osho was, in a sense, my first full exposure, and that it wasn't that kind of spirituality. I mean, he was very much into crazy wisdom and Zen. The Zorba, the Buddha, was one of his favorite sort of expressions. You know, the cafes were called Zorba, so that sort of exuberance of Zorba and the serenity of Buddha alongside each other was central to the whole culture and ethos of the place. Yeah.
So then, what comes next in your story?
Well, alongside that, I kind of, through the groups, I discovered I had a capacity for massage and healing. So I trained for about 2 or 3 years out with someone who wasn't involved with the sannyas community, a lady called Ann Parks, an American. She's still teaching somewhere in the USA, I think, who taught really beautiful energy-based massage. So I trained with her, and she used to invite in someone called Bob Moore, who was a Danish healer, who was also very powerful. He could read auras. So I got into that and started practicing as a massage therapist. And also alongside that, I did about 2 years training in PsychoSynthesis as well.
Could you describe PsychoSynthesis briefly?
Okay, so Assagioli, who developed PsychoSynthesis, was a contemporary of Freud. So he was part of the psychoanalytic community, but he also had some interesting links with the esoteric traditions of the time. I can't remember which teachers he was involved in, but he brought a spiritual dimension into psychotherapy. So psychosynthesis is a spiritual version of psychotherapy, in a way. It's very lovely. But he used visualization a lot and drawing. He didn't write a lot, but you know, there's a big movement. It's split into 2 or more movements now, but I still go back to a go-to place sometimes if I want to. I needed to work with a coach around a work issue that came up a few years ago, and I went to a psychosynthesis work coach, you know, so as a foundational way of working, it's very, very lovely. So I did that for a while, and then also another person who was involved with Osho was someone called Michael Barnett, who's called Samendra, was his sannyas name. And he started to develop some very powerful energy-based ways of working in a group which used music, the whole group tuning into the energy of each other and the group. And it was very powerful work. He developed it at the ashram. And then I was working in the London Osho Centre, and he came back and ran some groups there. And around that time I got married, and my husband and I then moved out to America to an Osho community there, and Michael actually came and ran some groups and trainings there, which we were involved in. While I was in America, it was the time that Osho also came to America, and he was living in New York State. I was in Massachusetts. And that was the beginning. That was before he went to Oregon. And that was the time there was a massive power battle going on between the various leaders of the community, between Sheila, who was in charge in Osho, and Lashmi, who'd been in charge in England. And I was totally aware of these power battles that were going on because I was so closely involved and so close to where he was. There was a lot of coming and going between the centre I worked in and where he was living. But eventually my husband and I had to come back to England anyway, probably visas, but various other reasons, money running out, etc., etc. So we came back, and that was the time that Oregon was set up. And I never went to Oregon. I didn't like the stories that I heard coming back from it. It wasn't the movement I had been involved in, which was all about spontaneity and joy, and that was all about hard work. And there was something very uncomfortable coming through, which I just did not like. So he would go, if people have seen Wild Wild West, Osho would do a drive-by each day in his many. I didn't like Rolls Royce bit at all. And all the sannyasins would come back from their workplace and stand along the roadside and celebrate. And the word was coming out that Sheila and the inner core were going around and telling people to celebrate more vigorously. Well, that for me was the absolute antithesis of what I'd picked up so far, which was about being authentic. You know, so something was going wrong at that point. So I was drifting to the side, and then Michael, who was
just before we get off Osho,
yeah.
and that period, you know, the kind of present time we live in, you know, with the internet and stuff, and so many documentaries and books been written about gurus and scandals and all of this. So there seems to be not many gurus or organizations built around gurus that have made it, you know, through with a squeaky clean record. Do you feel that the age of gurus is over, or if you know, if you do, then why? If you don't think the age of gurus is over, how do you think people can approach that decision to enter a relationship with a guru or a community in a way that's going to protect? I mean, you know, life is dangerous, but you know, we can't.
Gurus are dangerous.
Yeah,
even the best ones are dangerous.
You know,
they might just take your life away.
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about taking the fangs out of a snake. You know, so you know, snake has fangs. That's what it is. You know, it's but I'm not saying that gurus are like snakes necessarily, but you know, what advice would you give to somebody that might be wanting to do that now?
Well, the first question is the age of gurus over that you asked? I mean, I'm deeply grateful that I was part of all that. I would never, ever, ever, ever get back into that relationship with a teacher again. But the devotion that I experienced at that time was very heart-opening and very beautiful, and held me in a space that allowed me to go through a lot of transformation. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful the fact that he was such a big character. He did create this whole community around him. I think that was powerful. Do I know of anyone who was damaged through that? Apart from, there were more people damaged traveling backwards and forwards to India, I would say, than their experience at the ashram. It's quite dangerous sometimes.
Mm.
In a sense, I wouldn't want to. It's a funny question because, I really have a deep trust that our spiritual path is evolving in us and we have to go where we're drawn. So, the opportunities people have today are going to be different and what people are drawn to. I think there's a very fine line between a charismatic leader of any kind and narcissism, as we see loud and clear in the world today. So I'm sure that a lot of the best gurus have very strong narcissistic traits. And I suppose anything that one can learn about narcissism and protecting yourself against narcissism is important in terms of being around that kind of character.
Well, I've heard some people say that maybe the new model might be there's some kind of group of trustees, a group of trustees that they have psychotherapists that are part of the group which work with the leaders of these organizations.
Well,
and there's a lot of transparency, and the leaders are accountable to, say, an independent group of trustees and that kind of thing. What do you think of that?
Well, there's two things. Firstly, I think that the gurus that do real damage are the ones who haven't done any work on themselves and haven't confronted their shadow. So I think part of the process of becoming a teacher should involve some kind of psychotherapeutic work. I have had experience, I think it was true of Osho, but others as well, is you can set whatever guardrails you like around someone like that. They will always escape. They will destroy anything that gets in their way. So, it's like if they're signed up, fine.
But yeah. We're not going to answer.
You see it like with Trump. It's like he systematically gets rid of anyone who's trying to hold him in.
Maybe there are. Yeah, well, I don't have the answer. It's I think this is an inquiry that the entire.
There's a lovely book. Or she's written several books. Kaplan, I can't remember her first name.
Mariana Kaplan.
So she wrote Halfway Up the Mountain, which was about gurus teaching too early in their awakening. So half formed. They haven't really become mature in their teaching. But a more recent one is called Eyes Wide Open, and it's all the dangers that can be created in followership rather than in the guru.
Yeah, I think
I'd recommend that book to anyone.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. It's
discrimination is the thing. She's keep your eyes open and trust your instinct. If something is feeling off.
Yeah, you can't. I think you can't go into this like a child expecting to meet a parent that will tell you everything to do. It's people have to. It's a kind of a mutuality in a way between that. You're both responsible. The gurus and the leaders of these organizations have to take responsibility, but also the people who become participants have to take responsibility for their own lives too. But quite a lot of the time in young people 16 or 18 are getting involved, and that's quite a vulnerable age. I know what I was like when I was 18. I'm very impressionable, and I hadn't developed a very strong ego or sense of discrimination, and maybe that's just the peril of that particular age, being young like that, and there's nothing we can do about it. But.
No, and I see the same dangers as arising in. I'm doing a particular study of spiritual organizations at the moment, so I'm particularly sort of involved in all this, but I've seen it in organizations that don't even necessarily have a strong guru figure. You know, it's not just the guru, it's the danger of people who have not processed their psychological stuff engaging with the power of spiritual energy. You know, so anything that's off will often become accentuated or exaggerated. And people, yeah, and people are hugely vulnerable, partly because they're projecting all their parental stuff on a teacher, but it's also that entering into a spiritual journey, you have to take off your defenses.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, I mean, one of the things I like about the Trillium work, which I'm involved in, Trillium Awakening, is it's a collective of teachers. We have a very clear set of ethics, and not only do we have a clear ethics agreement between us, but we've got a process for dealing with something that goes wrong. And some of the organizations I've been looking at might have a code of ethics, but they don't have a process for implementing it. You know, it's like, if you break the rules, you leave. But no, you know, a normal organization has a complaints process.
Yeah.
You know, has a process to have people be accountable to the whole. So you need a code of ethics, and you need a process.
Well, that's one of the, you know, if we think of body, heart, mind, spirit, that's why I feel mind is an important part of this spiritual, you know, a truly whole spiritual growth mindset. That there's a kind of anti-intellectualism in a lot of spiritual communities, and to do something as mundane as create a code of conduct or a manifesto
or an organization.
Yeah, any of that
I
stuff.
don't like organizations. I'm spiritual.
It's the sort of the devil, you know. It's like that kind of stuff. Only square
That's what
people.
normal people do. Yeah,
That's it. Square people do that, but you know, it's that in a way that's shooting yourself in the foot by not provide. You know, that's providing some kind of. It's a structure, a container that exists outside. It's a third person thing. It's not to do with your truth, or you know, it's a second person thing. It's a third person artifact out there that is the touchstone. I think it's that's great that Trillium has that. I think that's really important.
But I think it's still then an interesting thing about where is the fire in an organization, which is a collective, and in terms of the integral, you know, it gets a bit green memey because everyone's got to agree with each other.
Yeah.
So finding a structure that both allows for that collective agreement and still has the power, that is what draws people ultimately. We actually did an exercise in the teacher retreat 2 years ago where someone actually took us through the different memes, the sort of integral, the spiral dynamic memes. And as an organization, we realized we needed more red.
Yeah.
You know, so which is the sort of fire and the, you know, so I think collectives is probably where it's going, but we're still learning a lot about how that can be effective for a spiritual organization that is really transformative.
That's a really good point. And I mean, some of the people who listen to this might be unfamiliar with spiral dynamics and these V memes, but you could simply say that you know, when you get a large group of people together and everybody's opinion has to be given equal weight, you encounter this massive stagnation and impotence and inability to do anything. And the red you were talking about there is more of that kind of forceful, powerful egocentrism that is that, you know, Donald Trump is a good example of that. I mean, you know, he's got that raw power and fire in spades, but you know, he lacks all the other stuff too, you know. But the idea with this spiral dynamics thing is that you're bringing all of these things online at the same time, and that you can have this kind of group consensus thing where people are bringing their own egocentric strength and a strong rational mind to it as well, and keeping some of these more sort of traditional structures in place too, that that conserving what has worked before as well, and you kind of bring all of that together, and the hope is that that creates something that is powerful, compassionate, and effective in a modern world too. So going on in your story.
Yeah, so I was saying that Michael Barnett was one of the main group leaders around Osho, and he went out to one of the annual celebrations out there, and it was a time when Sheila was basically clearing out any rival. There's a real battle going on. I've got a cat squeaking in the background.
That's right.
Actually, so
yeah, you slightly broke up there, but so you're saying Sheila was cleaning out any rivals.
Yeah. So Michael got thrown out of the community, and at that time, if you got thrown out, you were persona non grata, and sannyasins were supposed to have nothing to do with you. So overnight, he was part of a community in Belgium at the time, and a sannyas community. It was his community. So he kind of lost his friends, his job, and his home all instantly with this being thrown out.
God, that's
so
brutal.
What to do but get enlightened, which he did. Went off with his pregnant girlfriend and spent some time processing all that, and then started his own work. And at that point, we reconnected with him in his new incarnation. He called it the Wild Goose Company, which I love the name. And we actually invited him. By then, my husband and I were living in Glastonbury, and we invited him to come and do a group there. And in order to do that, to engage with him in that way, we in effect had to give up sannyas. So we both took off our malas and our orange clothes. And I then became very involved with his work and have been up till now. So that's about 30 years. And he died about 3 months ago, and this coming Sunday would have been his 90th birthday. So I've known him. He was the first group leader I went to when I was about 26. I'm now 72, so he's been an influence right the way through as a sannyasin, and then since that in his current work, which is very subtle, very beautiful work with subtle energy as a way to spiritual insight. And that's what I've been doing throughout, really.
So subtle energy is a very, very broad world. And I think I've found people find it quite difficult to make sense of everything that lies in there.
So it's very difficult if you've not, because I taught massage for some years, and I taught tuning into energy as part of the massage trainings that I ran, and most people got it. If you get them to do the right kind of exercises and sensitizing their hands and feeling into the energy and etc. Most people get it, but some people can't.
So, well, I mean, I was
can never pick up on the sense of it.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I think I was thinking that different people have broken down the subtle realm into all of these different gradations. If you know what I mean.
Yeah. I mean,
some of the sort of theosophists and.
No, this was all about experiential.
So this is a I mean, I'm just trying to think when you say subtle energy work, I'm trying to kind of get a handle of what type of subtle energy you're talking about on, you must have heard of all the different breakdowns of astral this and
Yeah, but I never hear
those
about
kind of
them
things.
talked about in terms of what the experience was.
Mm.
I mean, with Michael's work, there's very little by way of philosophy about it. It's just the idea that we are swimming constantly in energy fields. We are an energy field, and all these things can be experienced and responded to. So from my energy field, I can respond to your energy field, but it's not coming through the mind, it's coming through my response to you. So a lot of the work was very spontaneous. Well, spontaneous is one word to describe it, but it's like, where do you feel pulled? So I might sort of put my hand out and, where do I feel pulled to touch you? It might be, I feel like tweaking your nose,
Mm.
that might be an energy response to my field of energy and your field of energy coming together. But it's totally experienced through the body. It's not about processing or having an idea about it.
So do you I mean, I've had massages like that, and I've had some energy treatments where people haven't even been touching my body.
Mm-hmm.
More kind of energy healing
Sure.
would be the phrase for that. So how did you develop? Sometimes people think, someone might say, I've never been very sensitive to these kind of things, or that you might meet someone else who says, I'm just so sensitive, I always have been ever since I was a child. And do you think, is this something that's always been a feature of your in your life? Was it something that you had to develop and train? Did you have a
Well, no,
natural disposition towards it?
I trained in it because I discovered I had the facility.
Oh, you were saying.
Yeah, partly through doing the groups,
Mm.
and
It
but
wasn't
I
something
think
you experienced as a child necessarily.
I did.
Right.
I mean, I know now that I did, absolutely. And I'm just at the moment, I'm doing this in very lovely embodiment facilitation training, and really learning in a much more deep level to tune into the wisdom of my body in a much more conscious way. I just come back to a point I can't remember what it was you said, but my life was always split in a sense between my intellectual life, because I was a researcher, my whole, I have a PhD, da. So I'm actually a very mind person, but my spiritual life has always been, thank you very much, that's the weekday, set it aside, let's go and do this because I feel drawn to, and I'm going to leave my mind to a certain extent outside the door. I mean, not entirely, but I was very split.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time. But what I realized was that in all the spiritual practice and the group going into growth movement or whatever, I was using my body wisdom. It was my body wisdom taking me there. And I can recognize right back as a child having a very strong sense of what was going on and having insights which, finding things which my sister would rather meanly hide from me because she didn't want me to have it, or and I'd have dreams, or I'd have senses of where it was, even if she hid it, sellotape to the under of a side of a shelf in the spare room where no one goes, I would find it. So, and I would have a sense that I was, premonitions were very strong for me and all that. So yeah, it was all going on, but through the body. So the mind was never really, and that was before I was using my mind very actively. So
how did that work? I mean, so you have this split between your day job and then your leisure time, whatever, spiritual exploration time. That's quite a stark contrast. Was there a point where you thought, I can't do this anymore? Or did that always work for you?
I took a break when I joined the Sannyas community. I'd been working as a researcher in the Department of Health before. I left, I went to America for a while, then I went to Glastonbury and did massage and made candles and had my hippie period for about 5 years. And then I actually got invited back to the Department of Health to cover someone's maternity leave, and that got me back into research. And then I joined the Tavistock Institute, where everyone thought they were weirdos there anyway. So, you know, we were a bunch of weirdos together. So it was a very loose organizational community to be part of, and I felt, and still do feel, very at home there. Doing Michael's work, tuning into energy, was very helpful in terms of I have brought that into my work. So when I'm working, even if I'm working with my mind, you know, if I'm doing a piece of research, I'm still functioning in terms of tuning into the energy alongside that. And sometimes the two don't match. You know, I don't do it so much now, but I have to write research bids, for instance. And sometimes, you know, I've got to write this bloody research bid. My gut instinct, my energy field is saying, this is not going to fly. So, you know, I can't operate in an energy way purely, but I'm using it. But the split was coming more that Michael's work was very, very powerful in terms of just blasting into a space of very quiet mind and very in touch with consciousness. I mean, it's very, very powerful spiritual work. And then it was difficult to come back. At one level, it kind of shuts down the left brain. So it was quite difficult to come back into left brain activity after a weekend of that. I would sometimes have, well, firstly, I'd take some days off, but also I would sometimes do some, I don't know, cross crawling as a kind of exercise, which is about balancing the left, right brain. But, you know, I had to work to come back in. And it was the integration of the two only really came through doing the Trillium work. Because in Trillium, firstly, we're talking more, we're actually meeting in groups and talking about our experience. So there's a sort of integration of expressing your experience in words, which was really helpful. And secondly, I had what in Trillium is called the second birth, these days called whole being realization, in which at one point, my consciousness did a flip. And so instead of what I was feeling before that was, you know, in these weekends, I would go into this space of very spacious sense of consciousness and then lose it. And in flipping, I realized, of course, I was the consciousness, but a lot of the time my attention was on this limited me. And actually, at any time, there's a possibility of putting the attention on consciousness, and consciousness is there. So that was the point at which it really sort of the split. And then Trillium, Samuel, before that, Waking Down, came up with the term the core wound, which is this split between the spiritual, conscious, unlimited side and that limited, conscious, human side. And I was experiencing that as a very powerful experience coming out of the weekend with Michael, particularly with himself there, because he transmitted a very powerful energy, and then coming into work. So I don't know if that's an answer to the question. I can't remember what the question was.
Well, no, what it you know, it was feeling this split between, you know, the sacred and profane, perhaps, you know, was where I was phrasing it. And what you said, I think is great, because for me, at some point, you know, about 10 years ago, my location of identity shifted from being totally identified with my personality to being more identified with this sort of spacious consciousness that is, you know, people call the grounded being, you know, but I mean, we could just simply refer to that as awareness. to make it more normal and accessible for people, because it isn't. It's not a weird, some weird thing that's not part of everybody's lives. It's just they haven't actually noticed. I think so,
that was that was the big thing about my experience, was I suddenly realized, well, of course it's always there.
Yeah.
And it's very simple, it's very ordinary, it's very normal once you've recognized. But I think we have to go through a big journey sometimes all the way out there to come back.
Yeah. But in Zen, I think they call it the gateless gate, because it feels like you've gone through some gate into some new territory, but there was no entry into it ever. You've always been there. But when that shift happens for you, your relationship with your life, or life in general, has completely changed. In this kind of opening, everything takes on this character of connection and perfection, really, from that perspective. And I mean, I'm not putting this forward as the end of the journey, or the whole truth, but it's a very important moment for people when that shift happens.
And I think that shift happens in very different ways, and they're experienced very differently for different people. And I think that's, again, the great thing about Trillium, that we sit around and talk about our experiences, and you go, oh, that it's happened like that for you, there's nothing like that for me. So
well, that's really good to hear that in Trillium, which is this organization you're part of now, you actually talk about your experiences of awakening, because that's taboo in so many traditional settings.
Absolutely what took me right in there. We never talked about it in Michael's work. You just kind of went woo woo, and then you saw everyone else go woo woo, and you weren't feeling woo woo, and you're thinking, what's wrong with me? It's like, and then you talk to someone and you realize they weren't woo woo at all. It's like whatever. But to talk about it is brilliant. And
but because it's say like a sort of we've been talking about Zen quite a lot, but as sort of traditional Zen setting, or maybe not that. I mean, Zen's actually probably quite good at it, but some of these more traditional meditation traditions, if you start talking about your experiences of enlightenment, you'll get a sound bollocking. It's really unwelcome.
It's only the teachers allowed to talk about that. Hey.
And I think that's great. That these conversations are going on, and I personally feel it's really important, to talk about these things.
But I think what you learn from that is some people have a dramatic experience, and some people have and it was much less dramatic for me. And
mine wasn't dramatic either. It was very, very, just like, oh, wow, I never even noticed. I can't believe it. And then that experience has never left me.
Exactly. I just want to tell you a story from my first sort of spiritual breakthrough, which was very early before I became a Sanyasin, actually. I went to something called an enlightenment intensive, which is 3 days intensively working on the question, who am I, in pairs, and you change pair every 5 minutes, and and one person listens, the other person answers, tell me who you are, and you answer. It's very, very intense, very powerful. And I was doing it with a friend from Glasgow, and Charles Berner. It was run by him, and he set up this whole process, and he gave a talk on the 3rd day, and he said, some people get elephants and some people get dead mice, whatever is right for you. So my friend and I had been avoiding each other for most of the time, and he came over and said, I'm going to work with you, and he said, I just got a deed moose. And I got a deed moose too. I mean, I got a mouse of an experience, but it was like, I call it a mouse, not a deed moose these days. But it was like acknowledging that it can be just a little flip rather than a sort of massive, because so many of the teachers have had this sort of massive awakening that totally transforms their life.
Well, that's really a really important point to make, because if people are all looking for a massive experience, they're going to miss that. If their way was going to be one of these more subtle versions, we wouldn't notice it if
They
they were
wouldn't.
looking for the big thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I mean, one of the great paradoxes of awareness and consciousness is that awareness and consciousness is the place from which you do the looking. So you can't actually see awareness or formless consciousness.
No, it's why it's easy to miss. Like
Yeah,
easy to miss the nose if you
that's
didn't have a
it. I
mirror.
mean,
Yeah.
looking for it is actually a very misguiding term in a way,
Yeah.
you know.
And
But
we have to,
but
you know.
you know, one of the reasons why I connected with you in the first place is that you know, for a lot of spiritual traditions, meditation traditions, that is the end. That's the kind of goal.
Yeah. No, I
And
love in Trillium. It's called second birth. It's a birth, not an end.
yeah, so then, you know, so a lot of people are sold the story that, you know, that happens to you and then poof, you know, you don't need to, it's all finished. Growth stops there. It's another one of those things, you know, where it's like growth stops. So, you know, you and I have you know, you know, connected around this idea, have connected around this idea that that's not the end of the story. So what comes next?
Well, in the Trillium tradition, what comes next is what Samuel called the wake down, shake down. And that's when things get really bumpy. You know, it's not bliss and joy. Well, there might be quite a lot of bliss, and there's a nice, hopefully, a bit of a honeymoon period. And then the shit hits the fan because, you know, it's like consciousness comes in and starts throwing up all the unprocessed stuff to be processed. I mean, so probably in a lot of traditional religions, in the esoteric schools, you worked for years and years and years before even beginning to do whatever you needed to do to have an awakening. Now, in our world, we don't hang around for that. So to have some sort of awakening experience quite early on, you've then got all the shit to process afterwards, but you're doing it from a place of consciousness. Now, that doesn't mean say you don't lose it in the middle of whatever shit is hitting the fan currently, but you know, you and it stuff moves through quite fast because you're doing it it's held in consciousness. So there, I mean, in Trillium, I mean, it's talked about particularly the first 5 years. It's a pretty rocky space to be through, and a lot of people go into therapy during that time and really start to work on shit. I mean, I'd been working on stuff for a long time before, so I had a good basis, and I didn't have a very heavy duty wake down, shake down. I mean, stuff came up very strongly, but I'd done lots of processing.
Do you have like an ongoing therapeutic relationship with a therapist, or I mean, what, you know, what does your practice look like nowadays in that kind of realm?
Right, okay, so several of the Trillium teachers are therapists, and so one of the things in Trillium is working with a teacher. Now I'm an interning teacher now, but I still will have sessions with other experienced teachers, more experienced than me, or with different experience. You know, it's like you come to the stage where, okay, so earlier this year I did a Sufi course because I was attracted to it for other reasons, but you know, it was a beautiful one for rounding out the awakening of the heart. I'm currently doing this embodiment course, which has nothing to do with Trillium, but it's really grounding in me, in my body, in a way that's engaging my mind as well. So yes, and I think most of us in Trillium are doing some kind of work either with other teachers or, you know, whatever is drawing us to, you know, whatever the stuff is that's coming out that we need to process, really.
I'm glad you brought up the Sufis there. My you know, sort of first half of my spiritual journey was very Buddhist, and there's quite a kind of cold vibe energetically that comes from a lot of Buddhism. not all of Buddhism, but it's a kind of general
Mm.
vibe that comes off it. And I suddenly I realized that my heart had been kind of cut off, really. And I then became very interested in Christian saints and Sufis, and got really into it, Idris Shah and Rumi and Hafez and Kabir.
Mm.
Um,
I love
and
Hafiz.
sorry,
I love the poetry of Hafiz.
yeah, all that stuff. That and I feel like the Abrahamic religions really developed this incredible law around the heart. And the more Eastern traditions, I mean, these are massive generalizations. Of course, you got Bhakti yoga and stuff in India, but the sort of Buddhist thing is quite wisdom or focused, perhaps, or something. I mean, I'm struggling to find the word from it, but I think bringing those two streams together, it is a really important step, because I really feel there's body, heart, mind, spirit. They're all important at different stages in one's journey. You recognize that a certain part of that spectrum of your identity has been kind of left out of the game.
Yeah, and that's that's the journey. It's like feeling those gaps and doing what's needed to address that. So again, in Trillium, we often talk about some people awaken from the crown chakra into consciousness, some people from the heart into sort of devotion and heart consciousness, and some people from the belly, which is just that very simple being consciousness. And each person has their own process to awakening, really. And then after whichever one is taking you through to whole being realization, whatever, which is absolutely awakening through the whole and bringing it into the body. It's not a going out there sort of awakening. But then one is sort of rounding out the picture, as it were. And there are a couple of people in Trillium, a couple of the teachers who've been developing maps of the post whole being realization process, and one of them, Rod, has done a very beautiful one. And he well, it's very much true of him, but he, this awakening of the heart is almost the next stage after the awakening to consciousness. And it's almost sometimes you need the grounding in consciousness to be able to cope with the awakening of the heart.
For me, I wouldn't have had the courage to go so deep into my heart before I had a more familiarity with my identity as this great openness.
Yeah.
And
also being embodied, actually. Probably.
Oh yeah. So
to ground that, because otherwise.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, by the time I was getting more into this heart stuff, I had a strong foundation of physical work I was doing. I mean, the body work I've tended to do has been a less subtle. There's been a bit more guerrilla type.
No, totally. Me too.
Strength focused. But I think that emotions are so powerful, and these kind of what you might call transpersonal emotions that you experience in your heart, the type of heart awakening we're talking about, can be really destructive to your health. If you don't have that kind of physical container to hold it as well.
For me, it's the awakening to nature that's the most heartbreaking. So particularly at this period of ecological damage, I mean, that's what really breaks my heart. Rather than, I mean, people are pretty heartbreaking characters too, but it's a different quality.
Same for me, but and also becoming a parent, my heart broke. I mean, the instant my children were born, I suddenly a richness had come into my life that I'd never, the likes of which I couldn't have even imagined. But simultaneously, this enormous dread, and of the responsibility of being a parent, and for worry about their lives and living in this time, that we live in, with all the stuff. So it's, my heart broke and was healed at the same time when my kids were broken, and I feel the same, when I, like you're saying, when you look at Mother Nature, at the moment and going ahead. I love nature so much, and spent most of my life. I lived in London for 3 years, but it was physically that was a very debilitating time for me living there, and I was just craving nature the whole time. And so, okay.
You asked me about my practice.
Well, I wanted to see that. What would you say to people who are looking at the environmental crisis, and sorry, we're just cracking up a little bit there. Yeah. So what would you say to people that are looking at the environmental crisis and they are feeling their heart break? How do people navigate that turbulent sea?
I don't think that's my specialist area. I think there are people who are speaking much more beautifully about that at the moment. I mean, for me, it's a combination of having the space to have my heart broken and shutting things out when it's too much. I'm not going to recommend that to anyone, but I think there is a process of being gentle with yourself, being kind to yourself, and I'm doing that because I've always been a person who's very sort of responsible and wants to take responsibility and be active, but there's also a time of being gentle and taking care of yourself, and knowing when's the time for action and when's the time for taking care of yourself is something that only you can know, only the individual can know. Obviously, if everyone takes care of themselves and shelters, that's not going to do the world any good. And any activism has to be grounded in a deeper awareness of the whole and a deeper awareness of yourself. And there's too much activism. I mean, too much of the activism that I've been involved in over the years is totally unconscious, and it's just another form of anger and adolescent acting out. It's like we have to be mature. So working on ourselves as well as doing whatever we're doing in the world is important.
Yeah. That's a good answer and an honest one. I like it.
And also, I mean, for me, doing some kind of practice every day is absolutely essential. And I've had periods when I haven't. And it's very easy to get blasé about that, just taking time to be with yourself, to do some kind of meditation practice, to do some kind of embodiment process, to do some reflection. I was talking, one of the people I interviewed, who's done some amazing trainings and is still developing courses, he's singing, how did I make a fool of myself today is a great evening meditation.
Yeah.
Yeah. What did I do wrong? Yeah.
So I think, like one of the questions I wanted to ask people was, how does your practice connect you to the natural world? Because.
Well, today I will tell you very specifically. I have a rat in my back garden, probably living under my patio, who has just absolutely decimated my vegetable garden and all the seedlings. you know, what do I do? What do I do?
That is a koan. Yeah.
So sitting with those kind of koans, you know, and if the rat isn't digging them up, the slugs are eating the leaves.
Mm.
You know, it's heartbreaking in a way. You know, these lovely little tender plants that I've nurtured for
Yeah.
2 months, and they've just been decimated. You know, so someone will say, "Oh, you've got a rat. Put down poison." I can't. I actually can't put down poison for that rat. I'll probably get a humane rat box and try and trap it and put it up on Headley Heath or something. But you know, it's like, how does it connect me with nature? Well, it puts you in those kind of koans, because nature is both wonderful and amazing and tunes us into the highest realms and puts us in touch with you know, red in tooth and claw and the terrible things that happens in nature.
Well, you know, as during this at the time of this conversation, we're living through a massive natural phenomenon of the coronavirus.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a conundrum we're all living through. How do we live with this virus as part of our lives in the world? You know, that's nature as well, not just all the good things.
Totally. I mean, viruses and human cells have been in battle since the beginning, since we both evolved. So it's been a constant battleground, with one winning sometimes and the other winning at another time.
Mm. So is there anything you feel we haven't covered? I mean, looking at the sort of list of questions I've got, I really feel that we've touched on all of them, really. You know, through the narrative of your story. You know, so I'm always keen to you know, to tap into some people's personal practice, but how does their personal practice work in a community of people? You know, we're not just all hermits in the cave, so to speak, and then all, you know, wider society and the natural environment. You know, it's nested within all of those wider circles.
Yeah, I think there's space for community and there's space for hermits. I happen to be in a relationship with someone whose every inclination is to be a hermit, and I have to respect that. And I'm a community person, so you know, I think acknowledging and recognizing the diversity is. You had a strange question actually, which I'm going to go back to, which was, to what extent was something about copying.
Well, yeah. How have you made these practices your own rather than becoming a copy of another person?
Well, I think every teacher, any teaching I've been involved in, has been about growing one's, you know, your own authentic and spontaneous. I mean, with Michael's work, you can't copy what Michael does, because the whole practice is tuning into your own authentic sense of energy and responding to that spontaneously. So, you know, as soon as you start copying, you've missed the point.
Yeah.
And actually, Michael himself had a nice expression. He gave a talk once. He said it's a bit like birds imprinting, or when a fledgling learns to fly. You know, you kind of, the fledgling will watch the parent fly and might start to flap their wings, you know, but at some point they're going to fall out of the nest and they've got to bloody find their own wings. And you know, the process of having watched it and perhaps practiced is useful, but ultimately, you know, you've got to find your own wings and fly your own path. So I mean, for me, I've done so many different practices, I wouldn't even know what comes from where, but it's only really when you've sort of digested them and made them part of yourself that you're developing your own practice. And my practice now, I wouldn't say belongs to any one tradition. It gets fed by different streams at different times. And I did a mindfulness, an MB, whatever it is, mindfulness-based stress reduction course earlier this year. Absolutely loved it. I wish I'd done it years ago. That was another question. What mistakes had I made? Not doing a mindfulness course right at the beginning.
Yeah.
So, but then, you know, maybe if I'd done it early on, it wouldn't have had the same impact. So
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Sometimes you're right. The fruit is ripe, you know, this when it's ripe, isn't it? For any of these particular things.
yeah.
Yeah, there's
And,
some things like,
and
sorry.
the other thing is just trusting my, I mean, I was blessed in the fact that for some peculiar reason I did trust my intuition. So, you know, taking sannyas, which is about the nuttiest thing that a good, respectable, middle-class English girl could do, you know, it's part of me was saying, what? But it was the right thing to do. Becoming a Trillium teacher, I mean, for heaven's sake, something more scary than putting yourself out and saying, I'm going to be a teacher. Well, you know, part of the whole large part of myself is saying, ah, and then, but another part is saying, oh, this is the next challenge. Come on, you know, jump in, see where that will take you.
And another part of you, I imagine, feels this is right. You know,
I
like
wouldn't
this
do
is
it
time.
again.
You know, this is the time. You know, got to step up to the challenge that's been called.
Yeah, yeah. And if at another point it didn't feel right, then I would step out of it again.
Yeah. Oh, hang on, we've just gone a bit glitchy. Yeah, one thing I wanted to say about the thing of being a copy of other people is there's nothing wrong with, in the early phases of learning anything, imitating other people. And you know, I taught the drums for many years, and nobody goes straight into improvising their own music. You know, you start by learning other people's songs, and you know, someone's telling you how to do, you know, what to do, and then only after you've kind of metabolized that and integrated it, then you can start to make your own music. I mean, you can always make your own music right from the start. Anybody could do that, and I always encourage that as well. But I was always did some kind of formal learning where they were learning from books and stuff that was out there and being created by another person. And sometimes people can't bear, if you think that someone's learning to sing, now let's say the violin, some people can't bear to go through the phase in the beginning where they're making awful notes on it. They just want to get straight to the bit where it sounds really sweet. And I mean, I've had it to the same actually with drum teaching. You know, some people just, they couldn't play in time, or they weren't coordinated, and they found it so, they were so humiliated. And the best students were the ones that didn't mind that. You know, I really, as a teacher, I tried to soothe and lubricate that journey for people of like, it's okay, you know, it's really okay to be making what you think is a horrible sound, and you don't need to worry about me because I've seen thousands of people do this, you know. And people, you know, they trust what's happening, and then they just keep going, and then before they know it, they're making the sweet sound. But the worst students were the ones that they did it. Everyone had told them that,
get it right.
that's it, they wanted to get it right. Everyone had told them their whole life, you're amazing, everything you do is incredible, or something like that. You know, there's lots of reasons why people get into this.
The embodiment course, I think the second session was about what he calls the trolls of learning. Might have been the first session. You know, what are all the things that get in the way of you learning something new? And it was just, you know, we were encouraged to reflect and watch. You know, it's like, I don't want to make a fool of myself. I want to get it right. I know better. I'm just going to pull back and disengage. You know, it's like we have 101 different trolls that get in the way of learning something new. But to actually bring those into consciousness and sort of say, okay, right. Oh, I don't have that troll. You know, it's like, that's right. The next one was a session on meditation. And boy, did my trolls come up. I know better than this guy. He's getting it all wrong. So yeah, the stuff that gets in the way. The MB, whatever it is, the mindfulness course starts with, the first session is very much on beginner's mind. So, you know, that being in that stage where you're willing to admit you don't know, and
Yeah.
Everything is fresh and new.
There's a really great Zen story which is related to what we're talking about here, of this scholar who comes to a Zen teacher and says, tell me about your Zen, and that's it. Yeah. So saying, for those of who haven't heard the story, this scholar comes and he's got all these ideas about what it's all about, and it goes to the Zen teacher, tell me about your Zen. And the master starts pouring him a cup of tea, and when it gets to the top, he just doesn't stop pouring, and it's just pouring out over the cup. And he says that your cup's so full that I can't pour my Zen into it, or something along those lines. And it says so much about what a good student in anything has to have, that humility of the beginner's mind, and having the empty cup. It's
I read that story actually. In terms of integration, since shutdown, I've been holding quiet half hours for my colleagues at work, which are essentially half an hour of meditation. But I just read something beforehand, and that was one of the ones the stories I read to
nice.
To start up, because we're all very mental. We know.
Yeah.
No, it's a great story. It's actually the first story in the book Zen Blood, Zen Bones, I think it's called.
Oh, that's a great book. That's got and the great thing about that book is at the end it's got a whole thing on Kashmir Shaivism, which is really, that's cool. That's awesome. So it's a really good book, a very old book.
Kashmir Shaivism is very core in some ways to Sanyal's work. We've been talking a lot about it in Trillium, so it's very much
and that's for anyone listening, that's Sanyal Bonda.
Yeah.
So is there, I think this has been I've loved this conversation. Learning about your life's been so fascinating. Anything you want to say before we finish? I mean, you can say about where people can find more about your work, but that'd be the last thing you say. What is there anything you think we haven't covered which you think you want to?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think a theme in quite a lot of what we've been talking about is just diversity. And I think every tradition, every movement, every organization, of which I have been involved in quite a lot, there's a tendency to want to say, this is the way it is, and this is the kind of experience you're having. And to just recognize that our path to awakening awareness, whatever it is as individual as ourselves. And there are as many paths and as many experiences and as many routes. And you don't know until you start the journey how it's going to unravel. So and I hear a lot of arguments in a way when people do start talking about their spiritual experiences, it's like, no, that's not right. It should be like this. And, it's such a pointless argument because it is how it is. And as I say, the diversity, for one person, it's very simple. Other people, it's dramatic. For one person, it'll be all about opening the heart. For another, it'll be through the body, or through consciousness. So, just acknowledging that diversity and acknowledging whoever's listening to that, your individuality, and saying yes to that is so important.
Great. That's good advice. And so where can people find out more about things you care about? Maybe things you offer, or even things that you want the more people in the world to know about.
Well, there's a profile of me on the Trillium Awakening website, which has profiles. There are about 42 teachers, I think, in Trillium now, and I'm one of those. So there's a profile there. There's a community here in the UK, which people can find out about by contacting me, and there's also someone else in London her name will also be on the Trillium website, Beth Griggs. But to join activities here, there are a number of groups that meet regularly, but you kind of have to, people have to get to know you, and you have to be invited into a group, essentially. Though we sometimes have open events and open workshops. So it's not the easiest thing to get involved with. We don't have a UK website. There is a UK Facebook page. I am just finally finding my way onto Facebook, which is a big adventure. And I am talking with someone about setting up a web page, but that's probably some ways ahead. But sanjihills@gmail.com for me. Trillium Awakening is the website, which is based in the USA. I'm the only teacher this side of the Atlantic. That's it, really.
I think for people that are into this multidisciplinary thing, this integral life practice, if they approach Trillium, the good thing about Trillium is that they're not going to be told, oh, working on your ego is a waste of time, or sorry, it's gone a bit glitchy there. Okay, so I was saying that
ego is alive and well.
Yeah, so we're in Trillium, as far as I gather from the sort of surface contact I've had with Trillium, is it's not you go there, ego is welcome, spiritual experiences are welcome, body work is welcome, mental theories and stuff are welcome. It's like
life dramas are very welcome.
Yeah, so it's a kind of group that welcomes that whole spectrum of who we are. And what frustrates,
just to say, it's called Trillium because it's working on the consciousness, embodiment, and mutuality relationship, all three simultaneously.
Like a yeah, great.
So the Trillium is a beautiful North American flower with 3 petals, which is in flower right now, I think, in May anyway.
That's a beautiful symbol for it.
And it's called the wild flowering of our spirituality, which I also love.
Awesome. That transmits a lot in just that phrase. So if someone approaches that, it won't be like going to some of these other more partial communities or groups where you go there. If you start talking about working on your personality, they'll be like frowning on you, or your body's an illusion, and you should just, your body's a cancer, that kind of thing. So you won't encounter that kind of vibe from
but
Trillium.
Nor will it be you have to work on your body or you have to work on your stuff. I mean, working on your stuff is encouraged. So great. And we're currently much more opening up into incorporating arts and music and other things. It's been a bit talk orientated up till now, but I'm just currently working with a team on developing a sort of set of self-inquiry tarot cards, so with some beautiful images.
Cool. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you taking the time out to be so generous and share your story and your wisdom with me and anyone listening. And
thanks for inviting me, Ralph. I don't often talk about myself, so it was a great pleasure. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
And stay safe, as everybody's saying.
Stay well.
Stay well. And it's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the last few months, and I look forward to having more interaction with you over.
Okay, and good luck with your series.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay.
Right, lots of love, Sanji.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.